What if I told you that the fate of a man, once a hero, would change in an instant because of a single encounter? Imagine the cold streets of the city, filled with the noise of bustling crowds, people walking by without a second glance at a homeless man sitting by the curb. His name is John, a former soldier, someone who once fought for this very nation. And yet, here he is, forgotten, abandoned, cast aside like he was never worth a second thought. But just as John sits there, a billionaire steps into the frame. Tailored suit, polished shoes, the kind of man whose wealth could change the world, or destroy it. He walks past John without breaking his stride, not sparing even a glance at the man who sacrificed his youth and health for a country that no longer cared. Instead, the billionaire laughs, mocking him, as though the very sight of him is a joke. Pathetic, the billionaire mutters, casting a glance at John as if his very existence is an inconvenience. The kind of man who believes that money can buy anything, respect, dignity, even humanity. To him, John is nothing more than a reminder of something he'd rather forget, a man who didn't play the game right. But here's the twist. This wasn't just another day. This wasn't just another moment of a homeless man being looked down on by a rich man. No, this time, something was different. Because the billionaire didn't know who was about to walk into this very scene. He didn't know that the man he had just dismissed, the one he thought was powerless, was about to be swept up in a force bigger than both of them combined. A force that could change everything. And that force, that game changer, had a name. Elon Musk. The billionaire didn't know it yet, but his arrogance, his careless disregard for another human being, was about to backfire. Elon Musk, the man who had revolutionized industries, had just entered the scene. And when he spoke, when he made his move, it would be a moment the billionaire would never forget. John Miller had lived in the streets of Los Angeles for far too long, but this wasn't how he'd envisioned spending his later years. He had once been a proud soldier, his chest adorned with medals, his reputation known far and wide. He had served his country in ways that most would never understand, fighting battles in foreign lands, facing dangers that would forever haunt him. But those days were long gone. The bright future that had once been promised to him after his service had turned into a cruel joke. When he came back from the war, he was promised a chance to rebuild. But there were no parades, no heroes welcome. Instead, there were paperwork, delays, bureaucracy, and a system that just couldn't seem to care. The bills piled up, the job opportunities were scarce, and no matter how hard he tried, the world just kept pushing him aside. The fight for a life post-service was one that John was losing every single day. As the years passed, John's situation only worsened. The veterans' benefits he had been promised were never fully delivered. His once vibrant spirit began to wither under the weight of constant rejection. Every knock on a door went unanswered. Every attempt to ask for help was met with more forms to fill out, more phone calls that never got returned. Every day on the streets felt like a reminder that he was a casualty of a war that no one seemed to care about anymore. And that's when it happened. The day that John met the billionaire, a man whose wealth was enough to make him the most powerful person in the room at all times. The kind of man who couldn't fathom what it meant to struggle, to fight for survival, to lose everything and still hold on to hope. To him, those like John were nothing more than an inconvenience, a reminder of the flaws in a society that had long abandoned the ones who needed it most. John wasn't just another face on the street that day. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with a world built on greed and indifference. And this billionaire, the very embodiment of wealth and privilege, was about to make sure that John understood just how far the divide between them had grown. The billionaire had been passing through, on his way to a meeting that could make or break a new deal. He didn't notice John at first. He was too consumed by the pressing matters of his world. But when his eyes did fall on John, sitting there, with his torn jacket and ragged boots, something in him snapped. Pathetic, the billionaire muttered under his breath, though loud enough for John to hear. What a waste. You'd think you'd at least have the decency to clean up if you're going to beg for money on the streets. John felt the words sting, like an arrow piercing his heart. The man's arrogance wasn't just in his words. It was in the way he looked at John, like he was beneath him, like he was nothing. A worthless, forgotten relic of a society that had no room for someone like him anymore. In that moment, something inside John broke. He had been called worthless before. People had crossed the street to avoid him, pretending he didn't exist. But never had someone been so bold, so callous, as to mock him to his face. And not just anyone. A billionaire. A man who probably didn't know what it was like to feel a day of hunger, or fear, or isolation. What hurt the most, though, was that the billionaire wasn't wrong in his own eyes. To someone like him, John was indeed worthless. The rich man knew the power of his money. It could buy him anything. And to him, that gave him the right to look down on anyone, to reduce them to a joke. His wealth afforded him privileges that the rest of the world could only dream of. John wasn't just a homeless man. He was a symbol of something far greater. The cracks in a society that promised opportunity, but delivered only indifference. He represented the invisible people, the ones the world had turned its back on, the veterans, the poor, the disenfranchised, all those who had once given their all but were now forgotten. The billionaire's words echoed in John's mind as he sat there. His body slumped, feeling smaller with each passing second. He knew he couldn't fight back. He had no power, no leverage. He was a man beaten down by life, abandoned by the country he fought for, now mocked by the very people who reaped the benefits of his sacrifice. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a microcosm of a deeper issue, one that plagued society as a whole. The rich got richer, and the poor stayed where they were, stuck in a never-ending cycle of poverty, rejection, and despair. Those in power stayed on top, while those who needed help the most were left to rot. John's mind raced, but there was nothing he could do. The billionaire had already moved on, striding away with his head held high, oblivious to the destruction he had just caused. To him, John was nothing. To John, the billionaire was everything. Proof of how the world had failed him and so many others. The injustice was overwhelming. It wasn't just one man mocking another. It was the system, the society, the broken promise of what it meant to fight for something greater than yourself. But what the billionaire didn't know, what no one knew, was that this wasn't the end of John's story, not by a long shot. John might have been down, but he wasn't out. And the world? Well, the world had a funny way of balancing things out. He may have been invisible in the billionaire's eyes, but he wasn't invisible forever. Because someone else was about to step into this scene, and their presence would shift the balance of power in a way that neither of them could ever have expected. John sat there for what felt like hours, the cold biting through his clothes, numbing his body, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his chest. His mind replayed the encounter over and over, the billionaire's words echoing in his ears. Pathetic. A waste. The sting of those words was sharper than any physical pain he'd ever known. The mocking tone, the sneer, it wasn't just a personal insult. It was a reminder of everything he'd lost, everything that had been taken from him. He had given everything to his country. He had fought in wars that had nothing to do with him, had sacrificed pieces of himself that could never be returned. And now, here he was, sitting on the cold pavement, ignored and scorned by the very system he fought to protect. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He was nothing, just another forgotten man in a world that cared more about money and status than the lives it discarded. John's eyes drifted across the street. The world continued to spin around him, people walking by, heads buried in their phones, ignoring the man who had once stood tall beside them. He thought about all the veterans he had known, the brothers he had fought alongside. Some of them were gone now, their names barely remembered, their sacrifices fading into obscurity. What had it all been for? He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the brick wall behind him, the cool surface offering little comfort. The tears threatened to rise, but he held them back. He wouldn't give in to that. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. He couldn't afford to break, but the truth was, he was close. He was so close to giving up. John had long ago accepted that he wasn't going to change the world. It wasn't realistic to think that someone like him, someone with no power, no influence, could do anything. He had been waiting for someone to throw him a lifeline, to pull him out of this hell he was trapped in. But no one had ever come. No one ever would. And then, just as the despair began to settle in, the thought crept into his mind. Maybe the world didn't owe him anything. Maybe all that mattered was survival. Maybe it was time to stop expecting anything more and just get by. He had done it for years, after all, survived. But just as he was about to let that dark thought consume him, a voice broke through the haze. It wasn't the billionaire's voice. It wasn't the voice of a passerby who looked at him like he was invisible. No, this was different. This was someone who saw him. "Hey, are you all right?" John's eyes snapped open and his heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone to speak to him, especially not now. It was then he saw who it was, the man who had approached earlier, the one who had witnessed the whole exchange. Elon Musk. It didn't register at first. Elon Musk? Here? Of all places? The man who had changed industries, revolutionized technologies. He was standing in front of him, looking down with concern. It felt surreal, like some kind of dream. John didn't know what to say. He could barely find his voice. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. Was this some kind of joke? Was it too good to be true? I'm fine, John muttered, his voice thick, his pride clashing with his reality. He didn't want to be a charity case. He didn't want to appear weak in front of someone who could have everything and anything he wanted. But Elon's expression softened. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no judgment, just empathy. "You don't look fine," Elon said, his voice calm, steady. "You know, this city, it can chew you up and spit you out if you let it. But you've got more fight in you than that. You've got more than what that guy gave you." John blinked, confused. What was this? What was happening? This wasn't supposed to be real. "You don't have to take that," Elon continued, his gaze unwavering. "That guy, he's got money, power, sure. But that doesn't mean he gets to make you feel small. You've been through worse. You've survived worse." John felt a surge of something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was a fragile thing, like a flickering flame in the wind, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, John found himself questioning everything he had believed. Could it be? Could this be the moment he had been waiting for? The lifeline he had hoped would come, or was it just another false hope, another empty promise? Elon paused for a moment, studying him, like he was searching for something. "You're not just another homeless man," he said, his words ringing with sincerity. "You're a veteran. You've got a story, a voice, and you deserve to be heard." John's heart pounded in his chest. It felt like a dam had burst inside him. This man, this stranger, saw him, really saw him. And he didn't look at him with pity. He didn't look at him like a problem to be solved. No. Elon looked at him like he was someone worth fighting for. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The busy street around them faded into the background, and all that remained was this man standing before him, offering something John hadn't dared hope for in years: understanding. And then, in that stillness, something inside John shifted. The power dynamic, the weight of the world pressing down on him, began to tilt, not because of the billionaire, not because of the system, but because of the words that Elon had spoken, because someone had finally reminded him that he wasn't invisible, he wasn't worthless. The decision was clear. John's shoulders straightened, as he looked up at Elon. This was his turning point. He wasn't going to let the world decide his worth. He wasn't going to let the cruelty of one arrogant man define him. The fight inside him, the soldier who had once stood tall, was still there. He was done waiting for a savior. It was time to save himself. "I'm not just a homeless man," John said, his voice firmer now, rising with the resolve that had been buried for so long. "And I won't let anyone forget that." The shift in his voice, the strength he had been hiding all these years was undeniable. The fight had ignited once again. The power had shifted. And now everything was about to change. As John stood there, the world seemed to shift around him, as if the very air had changed. The words Elon had spoken were still ringing in his ears, echoing with a clarity he hadn't heard in years. "You've got a story. You've got a voice." It felt as if the dam inside him had cracked, releasing a flood of pent-up emotions, anger, and untapped potential. But even more than that, it gave him something else, the feeling that he could take control of his life again. For so long, John had been nothing but a casualty of the system, a man discarded by society, an afterthought. But now, standing here, with Elon Musk, the moment had arrived. The moment where he realized that he had been playing by someone else's rules for far too long. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. The truth began to sink in. John wasn't just any veteran. He wasn't just another homeless man on the streets. He had skills, knowledge, and experience that could change everything. And the one thing that Billionaire had failed to see, the thing that John had hidden deep within himself for so long, was that he wasn't as powerless as he thought. Elon seemed to sense it too. There was a moment when their eyes locked, and for a fleeting second, John saw something in Elon's gaze, a kind of understanding. It wasn't just sympathy or pity. No, it was recognition. Recognition of the strength John had buried beneath, the years of rejection. But the real breakthrough came when Elon turned to him with an unexpected proposition. "You ever thought about doing more with your story?" Elon asked, his tone casual, but with a depth that belied the simplicity of the question. "I mean, you've got a unique perspective. People need to hear it." John frowned, confusion clouding his features. "What do you mean? What can I possibly do with it? I'm just a guy on the street." Elon shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's where you're wrong, John. You're not just a guy. You're someone who's been through something that no one else can understand unless they've walked in your shoes. People will listen. Hell, people need to listen. And I think I can help you make them listen." For a brief moment, John felt a sense of disbelief. Was this really happening? Was Elon Musk, the man who had changed the course of history, really standing here, offering to help him? But the truth was undeniable. Elon wasn't just offering him an opportunity. He was offering him a chance at redemption, a chance to reclaim what had been taken from him. "I can't change the past," John muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't undo the things I've been through, but maybe I can make sure that no one else ends up like me." His words were quiet, but they held a weight that only someone who had lived through the very darkness he was talking about could understand. Elon nodded, his expression firm. "That's what I'm talking about. It's not about changing the past. It's about shaping the future. You've got a voice, John, and people will listen." With that simple statement, something inside John shifted. He was no longer the broken man who had been discarded by the world. He wasn't the powerless veteran who had been mocked on the streets. No, in that moment, he saw himself differently. He saw himself as someone who could fight back, someone who could challenge the status quo. The next few days were a whirlwind. Elon kept his word. He didn't just offer empty promises. He made calls, pulled strings, and connected John with the right people. Before John knew it, he was standing before a team of journalists, being interviewed for a documentary about veterans and the systemic failures that left so many of them on the streets. The cameras rolled, But John wasn't nervous. He wasn't the same man who had once felt small, invisible. As he spoke, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of power, the power of his own voice, the power of truth. And as the interview came to a close, something remarkable happened. The world started listening. His story was shared on social media, picked up by news outlets, and the response was overwhelming. People began to take notice. They were outraged. They were moved. And for the first time in a long time, John felt seen. But it wasn't just the media attention that had shifted the tides. It was the support that began to pour in from every corner. Donations to help homeless veterans, community programs dedicated to aiding those in need, laws being reviewed to ensure that veterans were given the benefits they were promised. The world, it seemed, was waking up. And as John stood on the stage at a rally, speaking to a crowd of thousands, he realized something even more profound. The true power he had was not in his past, not in the struggles he had overcome. The true power was in his ability to change the future, to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the same fate he had. He had gone from being invisible to becoming the face of change. Meanwhile, the billionaire, the one who had mocked him so cruelly, was beginning to feel the consequences of his actions. The backlash against him was swift and unforgiving. People began to question how someone with so much could be so callous, so dismissive of a man who had sacrificed everything. Sponsors pulled their support. His businesses began to lose clients. The power that had once been so absolute was starting to crumble piece by piece. In the end, it wasn't just Elon Musk who had helped John find his voice. It was the world that was finally listening. The tables had turned. The billionaire, who had once thought he could destroy John with a few careless words, was now the one facing the consequences of his arrogance. And John? Well, he had found something far more valuable than money or fame. He had found his purpose. The journey he had started years ago, the fight he had been too tired to continue, was now more alive than ever. The power had shifted. And now it was his turn to lead. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. John's life had turned on its head, and the man who had once been ignored, forgotten, and dismissed by society was now standing at the forefront of a movement. What had once been nothing more than a distant hope, the dream of a future where he was seen, where his voice mattered, had become a reality. And it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was the voice of thousands of veterans, of the homeless, of those who had been cast aside by a society that claimed to care, yet too often turned its back. Elon Musk had kept his word. The media, which had once been indifferent to John's plight, now followed his every move. He was interviewed on television, his words powerful, cutting through the noise of an ever-busy world. His story resonated deeply with people. Veterans everywhere were reaching out to him, thanking him for giving them a voice, for showing them that they were not alone. For the first time in years, John had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving. He was changing lives. And the billionaire? Well, his life was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. It all started when the backlash against his public mockery of John grew louder. Social media erupted in outrage. People who had once praised the billionaire for his business acumen now turned on him. The very qualities that had made him wealthy, his confidence, his ruthlessness, became the things that the world despised about him. The comments flooded in. How could he laugh at a man who gave everything for his country? What kind of person mocks a homeless veteran? But it didn't stop there. The corporate world, where the billionaire had once thrived, began to withdraw its support. Companies that had partnered with him, brands that had built their reputation on his influence, started severing ties. Sponsors pulled out of his events. His investments in high-profile startups began to falter. What had once been an unshakable empire was now crumbling. John wasn't alone in his victory. He had ignited a fire in the public, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Every day, more stories surfaced of veterans who had faced the same neglect, the same cruelty, and the same cold disregard. John's story was no longer just his own. It was a rallying cry for all those who had been pushed to the margins. People who had once accepted their fate were now demanding change, fighting for their rights, their dignity, their lives. And as the billionaire's empire collapsed, John found himself speaking at rallies, addressing crowds of thousands who had once overlooked him just as the billionaire had. With each speech, his power grew. He wasn't just advocating for homeless veterans anymore. He was fighting for the broken, the forgotten, the voiceless. John had become a symbol of resilience, of what it meant to rise from the ashes of neglect. But it wasn't just about John anymore. It was about the movement he had sparked. The message was clear. No one should be left behind. Not the veterans, not the poor, not the marginalized. Everyone deserved a chance at life, a chance at dignity, a chance to be seen. Meanwhile, the billionaire, who had once scoffed at John, now found himself under the microscope. Investigations into his business practices began to surface. Whispers about tax evasion, exploitation, and unethical dealings grew louder. The media, which had once treated him like a god, was now ready to tear him down. His reputation was in tatters. The world that had once placed him on a pedestal was now watching him fall from grace. As the months passed, the billionaire tried everything to salvage his image. He offered apologies. He made donations to veterans' organizations. But it was too late. The public had seen through the facade. They weren't interested in hollow gestures or empty words. They wanted accountability. They wanted change. It was at this point that John received an unexpected call. The billionaire, desperate to salvage what little remained of his empire, asked for a meeting. John, who had once been invisible to him, was now the most important person in his life. It was ironic, really. The same man who had once laughed at him, mocked him for his homelessness, was now begging for his forgiveness. John wasn't sure what he expected from the meeting, but as he sat across from the billionaire, he felt nothing but calm. There was no anger, no desire for revenge. He had already won. Not just for himself, but for all the others who had suffered in silence. He had become the voice of the voiceless. The justice he sought wasn't in the form of punishment. It was in the transformation of the world around him. "I'm sorry," the billionaire said, his voice tight with frustration. "I should have never said those things. I didn't know. I didn't understand. But now I see that I was wrong. Please help me fix this." John looked at him, his expression unreadable. He didn't need the billionaire's apology. What mattered now was the work that lay ahead. The work of ensuring that no one ever had to face what he had faced again. The billionaire's power was crumbling, but it wasn't enough to just watch him fall. John had learned something more important. True power came from changing lives, not destroying them. "You can't fix it," John said, his voice steady, "but you can stop making it worse. You can help people. You can make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." And that was the beginning of a new chapter. The billionaire, facing the consequences of his actions, found himself backing initiatives he had once dismissed: veterans programs, homelessness prevention, and systemic reform. But it was never going to be enough to undo the harm he had caused. And as he tried to rebuild his reputation, the world had already moved on. John, on the other hand, had become something far greater than the man who had once been invisible. He had become a symbol of hope, of redemption, of what it meant to fight for what was right. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need the billionaire's apology. Because in the end, justice had already been served. The world had shifted. The power had moved from the hands of the wealthy and indifferent to the hands of those who had been overlooked for so long. And as John walked away from the meeting, he knew one thing for certain: the world was changing. And this time, he would be the one to lead the charge.